G'day and welcome to this episode of the Geopolitical Pickle. Today is the first of two parts where we speak to International Crisis Group's Senior Southern Africa Correspondent Piers Pigu. We cover a range of topics, including ICG's role dealing with conflicts across the globe, the ongoing insurgency in Mozambique and their relationship to the Islamic State, and finally, private military contractors such as Russia's Wagner Group and the state security considerations across the African continent. Stay tuned for part 2 coming soon and enjoy the episode. As always, we love to hear your thoughts, so get in contact and let us know what you think.
Well, thank you very much for being here. Today in the Geopolitical Pickle, we're going to have with us Piers Pigu. He's the senior consultant for Southern Africa for the International Crisis Group. He's also the former Crisis Group Southern Africa project director, and he's also a consultant for the Cabo Ligado project, which is monitoring the situation in northern Mozambique, in Cabo Ligado region, with everything that's going around today. Thank you very much for being here with us. Thank you very much for the sharing of your experiences that you're going to do now, and we can start.
Yep, so again, thank you very much for joining us. And I thought I'd start today with asking you about the International Crisis Group as an organisation. What do you guys do? What do you do specifically on Southern Africa? And then we can go from there.
Well, Crisis Group established in the mid-90s, essentially to conduct research and make policy recommendations around conflict prevention, conflict mitigation, and really to understand complex crisis situations as it relates to deadly violence globally. So starting with work in the Balkans, the work now is across 30, 40 countries globally, and the Africa program is the biggest program in the organisation, and my responsibility is the Southern Africa grouping, which kind of aligns with SADC member states excluding the DRC, and we have a kind of a deeper dive on issues around Zimbabwe, Mozambique, South African foreign policy, and a watching brief around violence and deadly violence in a number of other countries in the region. So when there's a crisis in Lesotho or Eswatini or Angola or Zambia or whatever, we would keep an eye on that and contribute to the organization's monthly publication Crisis Watch.
In that sense, you've been working lately a lot in the situation of Mozambique. Obviously, you're really active in Twitter in several conflicts all around the world. You've also been commenting, and you've also have published on the Ukrainian war, for example. You've been vocal in that sense. Coming to Africa, coming specifically to Mozambique with the situation, how do you see it being developed? It's been some few months already that the conflict is going on, some few years. There is a seemingly lowered violence which has carved up again in the past few months. Several actors included. We have the Rwandan forces. We have a SADC intervention with the South Africans. How do you see the conflict development lately? Because it's not that much in the spotlight, and it seems from outside it might seem that the conflict might be either ending or just lowering. But what is your impression in it?
Well, the conflict kicked off in terms of violent incidents in October 2017. So we're nearly 5 years into this conflict. There's over 4,000 recorded deaths, and that certainly would be an underestimation. And there's been an expansion in terms of conflict incidents over the last 2 to 3 years, which reflect the sustainable nature of what's been happening. There was not a large geographical expansion of the conflict between 2019, 2020 into the first quarter of last year. Really 5 of the province's 13 districts were most egregiously affected. But it was the incident of the attack on the town of Palma at late March, early April 2021, which led to the LNG development nearby on the Afungi Peninsula, and Total Energies suspended operations there for security reasons. that the international community took some attention, paid some attention to what was going on. Unfortunately, that's a reality that we face often when there's the threat of expatriate interest, then the international media turns on. But since then, of course, Mozambique was kind of pressurized into looking for external assistance, and in June and July of last year, so about a year ago, it cut a deal with Rwanda for a bilateral deal for intervention of the Rwandese military and some police, and at the same time a deal was being cut within SADC for the authorization to deploy a SADC force, first time ever SADC paying for itself. In fact, first time a African mission of this nature has ever been self-financing. And now we have about 8 or 9 countries from the region contributing to a force that is about 2,000 strong at the moment. It's just been expanded in Cabo Delgado. So you've got about 5,000 international security force members in place, trying to assist a somewhat demoralized, defunct Mozambican security sector, which is trying to reboot itself with a major training program at the moment from the Europeans and from some other supporters. During the initial months of the intervention, certainly there was a downtick in the number of attacks by insurgents. For the first time, they were being hunted and they were being attacked. And there has been, without doubt, a degrading of their capacity as they've been forced out of all their major camps. And they were forced back into deep forests. A number have been killed, a number have been captured. They've had to release hostages. They've struggled with food security and those kinds of issues. But what hasn't happened is that they haven't been totally defeated. And what we've seen is, particularly from October, November last year, a steady drip of incidents happening in several provinces. A push in late 2021 into Niassa province, which is to the west of Cabo Delgado, a series of attacks there, which forced a number of people to leave. Those attacks stopped by the end of December. And then we saw, most recently since May, middle of May, a push south of attacks into southern districts which had previously not been affected by violence, forcing another wave of internally displaced. I think 50,000 have been displaced by this latest wave of violence, but also simultaneous attacks in the middle of the country and in the middle of the district and in the north on the border with Tanzania. What this has demonstrated is ongoing capacity for the insurgents to maintain a level of terror and maintain a level of instability that is undermining the government's plans to get people to go back to their communities. And we could talk about IDPs and the return, which in turn is undermining the timeline for getting the LNG project resuscitated again. So there's a lot of wheels in motion at the moment around these issues of instability, and I think this latest uptick in violence is causing significant concern for investors and is going to complicate matters, specifically because some of us do not believe that the right strategy is in place, both in terms of the hard security objectives of dealing with counterinsurgency, but also with respect to the broader, wider angle of human security interests that need to be played out with the development agenda and so on.
In that sense, because of the SADC mission in Mozambique, as you were mentioning, is the first mission that is self-funded in Africa, and it's the SAMEM. And it's had different stages. The latest stage was the latest extension of it, if I'm not wrong, took place in the early July. But it is a peacekeeping operation, or is in name a peacekeeping operation. It's meant to be multidimensional. Do you think a peacekeeping operation is enough to carve down the violence in that sense?
In April, the last SADC emergency meeting, there was this decision to move from what they call, using the African Union framework of scenarios, from scenario 6 to scenario 5. So that was from peace enforcement to peacekeeping. But there was a kind of an acknowledgement that it would be kind of scenario 5+, that it would have to be peacekeeping with still a capacity for peace enforcement to be able to go hunt terrorists, so to speak, into the bush. Part of the shifting of designation was for political reasons. It also, I think, was a compromise agreement amongst member states who are already looking for a way out of this situation and are concerned about the longer term impact financially that drags them down, but also being trapped in an endless counterinsurgency situation. Also, there's some evidence that Mozambique is not keen to have them there, so would also be keen to see Salmon go at some stage. Their preference, quite clearly, has been to have Rwanda there, and they've been part of efforts to try and assist and support and promote funding for Rwanda. And we can talk about that in a moment, if you like. So the scenario 5 and 6 thing, I wouldn't read too much into it at the moment, because if it was simply a peacekeeping operation at the moment, I would certainly argue that would be inappropriate in the circumstances where you still need quite a strong peace enforcement capacity. Peacekeeping is having people in communities to keep some communities safe, and of course this is an essential component to encourage people to come back to communities. But there needs to be stability beyond the road arteries and the villages there, and they won't be able to put people in every community. And what you've found recently is that attacks are being launched on communities that either have no presence of security forces or have a smaller presence of particularly Mozambican forces who are quite easily overrun. And that's been our sense, certainly in the last few weeks, where we've seen a major emphasis on re-provisioning by the insurgents in terms of their weapons, in terms of food and so forth. So we could be in this kind of scenario 5+ for a considerable amount of time.
Yeah. On the actual insurgents themselves, you said that it's been an uptick in actual incidents, but is that related potentially to their affiliation with the Islamic State, being able to get more technological know-how, maybe actual weapons and things on the ground, because of their association or with other extremist groups as well?
The nature of the relationship between the insurgency and Islamic State is contested. In that some believe that Islamic State has a much greater hold on the local dynamics and the local direction of the insurgency. Clearly there is a relationship that is evolving. I think that's the first thing we need to recognise, and that there are connections between Islamic State elements in not only in Central Africa but elsewhere, in the Horn of Africa and so forth. This has been established from some of the intelligence that has been gleaned from materials that have been captured at bases and so forth. We've also seen a very pointed and significant uptick in Islamic State claims in the last 8 weeks, an unprecedented number of claims that are sometimes same-day claims. They're relatively accurate. Most of them geolocate to the places that they say. And this suggests that they have really strengthened their relationship with IS in terms of media jihad and propaganda. And we see them adhering to the IS rulebook in terms of how to present issues. And so this has kind of woken up a number of people about this evolving relationship. Now that may not translate at this juncture into the provision of weapons and technologies and other support. However, we would be foolish to assume that those issues are not explored, and there haven't been some instances of connectivity, whether it's around, it may be around the use of drone technology, for example, it may be around the development of IEDs. We've seen, for example, rudimentary IEDs being found in the Mozambique theatre of operation. At the same time, information about how to build IEDs on laptops taken from bases that have been captured and so forth. We haven't moved into the terrain of suicide bombers and this kind of stuff, and you know, these are issues that may well evolve. We've seen that evolve in the Central African structures as well, where we most recently saw suicide bombing attempts in Kampala. So that relationship, watch that space, is what a lot of people are saying, and we are likely to see efforts to see maybe some foreign fighters go into the arena. There's been these allegations all along that there have been some foreign fighters in place. There's talk of whites. They're reflecting, some say, Arabs or Chechenians or whatever that might have been there. But these have only ever been very small numbers, if you know, in terms of what's been on the table. The vast majority of foreign fighters come from Tanzania, and there's been a few from other places. But the bulk of fighters remain Mozambican, because this is essentially what's driving this insurgency are local dynamics, in which, as I said earlier, you know, it's a moving target, and what's clear is that there has been a radicalization process also for those that have joined the insurgency. You know, hundreds of Qurans have been taken in these raids. People, hostages who've been released, talk about radicalization programs and so forth. There's been video material found inside these camps of internal disciplinary processes, the implementation of Sharia, the removal of hands, and all this kind of stuff. But I think the impact and the traction is uneven. That's the sense I have. There's still a measure of independence from these smaller groupings, but one thing that the recent claims show, the claims which are kind of same day or within a day or so, and coming from 3 separate areas of the province, indicate a level of coordination as well, which we've known in the past, but it shows, and that coordination, you know, got ruptured to a certain extent with the offensives that were taking place when the Rwandans and Salmon came in. But it does look as though they're back together. And this raises questions about the nature of the supply chains, the communication networks, and so forth, that were put in place a very long time ago. Arms caches, all sorts of things.
So just to wrap up on Mozambique, I was going to ask you what you think the future prospects are for the conflict, given that, as you said, SADC troops are not that keen to stay there for a start. How entrenched are the Rwandans? The Mozambique Defence Forces are pretty much ineffective in actually combating some of the insurgencies. Will they need some external support, potentially someone else to come in to actually finally address this issue with a strategy that you talked about that actually doesn't just militarily address the issue, but also addresses the root causes, the local dynamics that have brought about this insurgency?
I mean, at the moment, the kind of the theoretical plan is external forces will pacify the situation, create a peacekeeping arrangement, and during that period, the rapid reaction unit of the Mozambican military will be trained up by the Europeans, and then will be, you know, available to take over. There'll be a expansion and fortification of the policing role, perhaps taking the local forces, the militia, that have been engaged in this, and formalising those relationships and so forth, to try and put something in place. That's, you know, which would allow the external forces to move on, so to speak, or to be only constrained or restricted to a particular area. First of all, I think the timing on that is unlikely. Over a couple of years, that the Mozambicans would be trained adequately to be able to play that role. You know, the training components need to be fortified with mentoring in the field, proper assessments, but they also need to be tied to other broader challenges within the security sector and security sector reform in Mozambique. And at the moment, it's kind of a bit of a silo in the way that these things are being done. And whilst there are efforts to try and get those that are involved in various training programs to coordinate a little bit more, because you've got, the Rwandans are doing some police training, the Americans are doing some Marines and Fusileros training, this one's doing this, to try and herd them together a little bit. As I said, this doesn't really fit into yet a broader sort of sense of security sector reform, political leadership, key leadership issues there. So that's a much longer term process that would need to be put in place. The other issue, which is of course right at the heart of the problem, is financing. Whilst the SADC may be very proud that it's financing itself, it knows that it's relying very heavily on the South Africans to subsidise smaller countries like Lesotho, but also that the funding is relatively low level funding for an operation, and we see that it's not insignificant amounts of money, but it's certainly not enough to put the right equipment with the right support structures and units in place. And this is most obvious with the paucity of air assets that are in play at the moment, that you cannot fight an effective counterinsurgency without good air support. And at the moment they don't have that. In fact, the anti-poaching unit DAG that was up there had more helicopter gunship air assets than are currently operating at the moment up there. So this is a huge problem, and financing that is going to be a struggle. Now, the Rwandans also have got their hand out looking for financing at the moment. I think a year in, because they're deployed almost a year ago today, it's not clear how much they have spent. There's talk of them, $1 million a day. That sounds a little bit excessive, but still, you've got 3,000 people in place, and you've got an infrastructure to support and so forth. It's not cheap. They claim they are self-financing. No one seems to believe them, and says that somehow it's some kind of dodgy secret French funding, or it's linked to Total or whatever. No one really knows, but they clearly are wanting to look for an alternative funding source. Both the EU and both SADC and the Rwandans have approached the European Peace Facility for funding. They are like this. These applications are being processed at the moment. They're likely to get some funding, but it's not going to be what they're looking for by any means whatsoever. There is no big pot of cash there for them, which is what they were looking for. And of course, in between starting looking for money, this Ukrainian war started. So the interest of folk outside is limited. But there's a caveat here. Obviously, the LNG sector is a very big interest to Western countries in particular, trying to diversify their dependency on Russian energy supplies. So that's kind of piqued international interest. So in terms of if I had to make a projection of where this conflict is going at the moment, is first of all, it's important to remember that to date at least, the insurgency hasn't deliberately targeted Western assets. There's some talk about this, and of course IS made a big noise in 2020 in the middle of the year, threatening South Africa and the Crusaders about the LNG sector and blah blah blah, and then they made a big noise in May about attacking the Graphics site, where they probably didn't even know where they were attacking. They just found some security guards they beheaded. So there hasn't been any kind of deliberate attempt to attack Western assets, to assassinate people in hotels in Pemba or whatever it might be. But so which raises questions about, well, if they were really interested as external insurgent, with an IS claim, then surely there'd be more attacks on those. That may be something we see, and I think there is an expectation from those working within that sector that that's where things may go, which I don't think is an unrealistic projection. But I think what this will contribute to is what we've been calling a kind of a green zoning, a Iraqification approach, where there'll be a fortification of Palma, Afungi Peninsula, the transit routes down to Mocimboa de Praia, the port there, and then routes through from Mocimboa de Praia through to Mueda, through to the quarries on that side and so forth. So that will be given first priority for security, which will maybe, you've had this joint task force there which was set up, which Total was subsidising previously in terms of the security arrangement it had with the Mozambican government. So they had 750 crack Mozambican troops up there working with Total security people and so forth. In fact, during the Palmer attack, those guys remained on that site. They didn't go and rescue their buddies in Palmer. I mean, so it's not particularly tested force there, but and there's some talk about the Rwandans maybe getting some contract to take over some of that role to strengthen their backbone on that kind of stuff. So that's what we expect, is to see a strengthening of security in those areas, and then a kind of low intensity conflict occurring in much of the rest of the province.
I wanted to ask you, because you were mentioning, obviously there's several interests. There's state interest and there's company interest. We're talking about LNG, and we saw that there were external PMCs that were entering Mozambique, and that they had really bad results. And this is it's a trend that obviously it's taken years, but it's come lately. It's been there for a while, but. PMCs taking roles in security, and companies hiring not just PMCs but also private security companies to take care of their facilities and everything. We're also seeing that in Mali there's these claims that the Wagner Group is in there. How do you see that role of these external actors or even states financing, using PMCs or using private security companies to take over these spreads of violence in particular regions of the country? I think it's a twofold. First is the state, because it's got a particular interest, and then is the external companies that they have their particular facilities and these matters. How do you see it, not just in Cabo Delgado, but in the rest of Africa in the foreseeable future?
Well, I think there's a danger that we lump PMCs together, and so it's important to disaggregate the different kind of roles that are being played by the different actors, the nature of the legal and contractual relationships that they go into, what kind of objectives, what kind of doctrines they're following, what kind of relationship they have with the state. So it's not a one-size-fits-all, and I think within that context you have private security companies, private military companies that operate according to the book, are relatively transparent and accountable. And you have those that are, you could say, rogue and are not accountable. Wagner has obviously developed a particular reputation, and over the last few months, a number of allegations about violations and so forth. The secretive nature of the deals that it makes with host countries and its relationship with the Russian state, of course, raises all sorts of questions, but also I think reinforced by prejudice that we have that have grown in relation to the Russian state anyway. So that's not a get out of jail free card for Wagner. Many questions that Wagner has to answer, but I wouldn't lump them in the same category as some other PMCs. In the Mozambican terrain, of course, Wagner were there for a few months and left. They were there on a deal with the FADM, the military at the time, and they got a bloody nose there, and it would appear that they had trust issues with Mozambican military. The involvement of the Dyke Advisory Group was interesting because, of course, they were already contracted for anti-poaching work there, and this seemed to be predicated on personal relationships. That Dyke himself had a long-term relationship with elements in the Mozambican firmament, so to speak, because of the work he'd done when he was in the Zimbabwean army against Renamo in the 1980s, and so he had some credibility anyway there. But Dyke was basically saying, I can do X, Y, and Z for this kind of price, and he signed on to a contract. No one's seen the contract, but he signed a contract with the Mozambican police, which kind of constrained him to work within the logistical and supply chains of Mozambique and the dysfunction that goes there. So it was it became a bit of what you might call I don't know if the term will be familiar to your listeners, a Heath Robinson operation. It was put together with bits of plastic, and it was cobbled together, so to speak, in a way that had to struggle to buy drums of fuel from here, to cannibalize machine guns from there in order to make one functioning machine gun that they could then bolt onto the side of a civilian helicopter, which they could use as a helicopter gunship. I mean, these kinds of things. And whilst the dike operation was never going to provide a solution in that context in particular, and the way it operated was it had a limited flight path in terms of operating out of Pemba, and then very limited time over target before it had to come back and refuel, because the Mozambicans couldn't get it together to put proper sites together which they could defend properly for refueling closer to the sites of operation. So they struggled, I think, enormously. But others have said, well, you signed up for that.
Exactly.
So you are responsible for that. And I think that's a strong argument that needs attention. And it goes back to the earlier point about what's your responsibility in engaging on this. So there will be many who will look at the dike operation as irresponsible adventurism. But I think my sense is that if dike had not been in place in April to push back, there would have been. I mean, they insurgents were on the doorstep of Pemba. They'd taken 3 district capitals within a matter of weeks, just before they came. So they kind of helped hold the line in some respects, and their plans to build a trainer force that could do, because Dyke as a Rhodesian soldier was trying to develop something called Fire Force, which is a particular method of counterinsurgency, of being able to fly groups of 20 to 30 troops into areas, proper aerial support with helicopter gunships that could be mobile and move around. And he never got traction on that. And in fact, you talk to security experts about Mozambique now, and you say, why do you think there's been no development of a fire force capacity in Mozambique? Silence. That, I would say, would be absolutely critical as part of a wider strategy for dealing with this at the moment. If you don't have proper air support, either in medevac or supplies or in terms of helicopter gunship, a number of these areas where they're fighting is impenetrable, and helicopters are not going to get through that canopy in the forest. But if you don't have proper air support, you are screwed. And I think that's what's happening at the moment, is that they haven't got in place proper air support. I don't even know whether the big Russian birds that they had flying there, Mi-8 and so forth, whether they're flying at the moment. They had Ukrainian pilots. Whether they've gone back and some of the old Mozambican pilots are flying them, but not, as far as I'm aware, in terms of operations to support offensives at the moment.
I wanted, because you were mentioning that the transnationality of the violent forces, in the sense not necessarily with foreign fighters, but that there are some claims of sharing intelligence, sharing technology, sharing practices. There are claims, even though you've been mentioning that, for example, in Mozambique, those claims are still claims, but there is no proper proof of that. Could the example of the Southern African Defense Corps, if the SADC, there in Mozambique as a regional force, be taken for addressing these issues in the rest of the continent? Because we've seen it with Ethiopia, where the African Union was basically didn't know how to handle the situation properly, or at least they didn't have the strength to properly handle the situation. We've seen it in Mali. We've seen in Mali you have the task forces, you have the G5 Sahel. Can those regional security alliances have some future, in a sense, and even maybe under the umbrella of the African Union become a reality where the Africans can actually have their own security in the continent, but supporting each other so that they can address these issues?
Well, what you're referring to is, in theory, what the objectives are of the African Standby Force. And I think one has to measure the nature of threats in different parts of the continent and look at the extent to which the standby force infrastructure that's been developed over the last 20 years sufficiently addresses those needs and where the downfall is. I mean, I think that you will find all sorts of limitations with respect to the forces themselves and the evolution of those forces. They're very uneven. Different countries have not led up to their commitments. It's a kind of, for some of these countries, the underwriting of these forces is not a priority for them. So there's lots of internal difficulties as it relates to that trajectory, but it does require Africa to review this process and see where it can build realistically. For the time being, it seems likely that there will be a reliance on some kind of hybrid arrangement at best, that you do need some external support, but the African nations would do the heavy lifting on these kinds of things. And I think that each conflict then becomes a subject to negotiation. That's got positives and negatives to it in terms of kind of marketplace competition, but and also that people then operate bilaterally outside of the parameters of the continent's multilateral preferences. That's the theory, at least. I mean, they talk about multilateral preferences, but many countries would prefer bilateral outcome. We see this in Mozambique, of course, who've kept the AU at bay to a large extent, kept SADC at bay for some time, but have accepted that they play an important role. But you don't see Mozambique coming to the table on this, which is ironic given they're just sitting at the United Nations Security Council for the next 2 years. They've just got their position there. Will this be a shot in the arm for multilateralism within Mozambique? An unanswered question. Let me just leave it hanging there. I wouldn't hold my breath. And of course, you've got to remember that the different regions have different approaches to multilateralism. And SADC itself has been generally reticent under principles of sovereignty and non-interference to engage in this. And actually, they struggled for a while in Mozambique because, according to their mutual defence pact, there wasn't clarity on being able to force an intervention, which they could do in certain situations, as opposed to having to be invited in. And that then becomes kind of terrain for competition and leverage against each other, and so forth. So I think that the longer term trajectory around Africa taking more responsibility, I think it's very much on the agenda, but it's going to emerge in a very uneven way, which will give space to external elements to ply their trade, to try and get in there and influence. And that's, it's a marketplace for influence, whether it's through weapons sales, whether it's through agreements on training protocols and so forth. And each country, West and East, has particular interests in the security field. And in a context where African countries, under that kind of rubric of sovereignty, are generally quite hesitant about and suspicious about external players, unless they can really calculate the cost benefit for themselves. And this is one of the interesting things about Wagner, as well as my colleagues make this point, is that Wagner is perhaps providing for African states what the French used to provide for African states in the 1960s and 70s, is a guarantee of security for the regime, without too many questions asked about things, but in return for, access to certain economic goodies and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
So, I think one has to be careful about that model being simply replicated, but it does resonate. And so those, going back to your earlier question about PMCs, rather have a relationship with an outfit that is not going to throw human rights and all sorts of standards and external scrutiny through, parliamentary committees in Europe or whatever it might be, if you can make a deal with an outfit that will deliver.
Yeah.
So it's gonna, it's going to be very interesting. But the sense I have is that we have a very fragmented approach to this at the moment, and it's not clear who are the drivers on the continent right now, because you need political champions, which you had in the early 2000s with Mbeki and Obasanjo and these kinds of people pushing this kind of multilateral vision, both in terms of security, in terms of economic governance and so forth. That's absent at the moment. We don't have that kind of drive and leadership, and we have a continent that's relatively fragmented.
I think that's a good place to leave it here for part 1. Stay tuned next week for part 2 of our interview with Piers Pigou.
Thanks for tuning in to Geopolitical Pickle.
We hope you enjoyed the episode, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
In the meantime, follow us on Instagram for more behind the scenes content.
And subscribe to us wherever you get your podcast.
Thank you, and see you next week.